Welcome back. We are going to talk about sports and the intersection with violence and racism for the next few minutes. Specifically, we're going to talk about hooliganism to start. We've talked a little bit about soccer in recent sessions, and hooliganism is violence that erupted around mostly the sport of soccer, although it did spill over into a few other sports. The reading in your Gaming the World book was focused primarily on soccer because that's where we've seen it most prevalent. You'll notice that the authors within the Gaming the World book described hooliganism and distinguished it from just random acts of violence that might happen because fans drink too much or other type of spontaneous violence. And I put a quote in here that you see there from the authors describing hooliganism as more intent, or describing hooligans as more intent on committing violence than on following the game or even supporting their team. So that's an important distinction, that that word intent, that hooligans come out to the match with the intent to engage in violence. There's a premeditation to it. Thinking about the history, we want to know, where did this all start? How did this connection become ingrained into the sport between hooliganism and the sport of soccer specifically? Well, like the answer to a lot of our questions when we're talking about a certain location or origin in the globe, it started in England. And mostly it started in the late 1970s, where the National Front movement, which was a political movement, it was against what we would think of as cosmopolitanism. So it was a political movement against being accepting and respectful of people with differences, specifically people in the minority class, be it minority races or minority ethnicities. So it was against integrating them into society and being respectful of their differences. It had a little bit of a neo-Nazi connotation to the National Front movement. And what happened was they realized, the leaders of this National Front movement in the late 70s realized that soccer was a great recruiting ground for them. Part of what made it such a great recruiting ground was the fact that the target market for the National Front was young, somewhat disenfranchised males and within the working class, and that was the same target market that the professional soccer or football leagues, association football leagues in England were targeting to come and show up at their matches. And so the National Front recruiters started to go to these football matches and mingle around with people and spread some of their ideology and their beliefs. And before you knew it, they were pretty much holding meetings in the stands or rallies in the stands of football stadiums. And what also made it very convenient for the National Front was that most of the stadiums at these times in Europe, we're talking about, or England specifically, on the two ends of the stadium just had terraces. So there wasn't seating like we would think, where you had rows of seats. It was just terraces, meaning open steps, if you will, tiered steps, and where it was standing room only. So if you're a recruiter from the National Front, you can go into these terraces and you can move around relatively freely, without the rows and aisles necessarily in the way. So it made it much easier to go in and talk to people and kind of almost hold rallies within those terrace sections where they found young males primarily there to watch the game. So that created this connection between the National Front movement and some of the English soccer clubs. Not a formal connection. The clubs themselves and the hierarchy within the clubs was not necessarily in favor of what the National Front stood for, but at the same time, it was creating more people in the stands and excitement in the stands. And so they also didn't push back against that movement and recruiting as quickly as they should have in retrospect. So this connection between hooliganism and disrespect of the differences and minorities and a general embrace of violence against others, this connection to the sport of association football had some terrible ramifications. A few different disasters happened in the 1980s. First, we'll talk about the Heysel disaster, which led to the English clubs being banned from UEFA competition. UEFA is the European football arm of FIFA. And it happened in 1985, May of 1985. It was a Champions final. Heysel Stadium is in Brussels, Belgium. The two teams playing was an Italian team playing against Liverpool. And most of the violence was committed by Liverpool fans. They killed 39 Italian and Belgian spectators within the rioting. And that's why the English clubs were the ones that were banned from competition. And this wasn't the first instance of hooliganism, you know. So it's not like FIFA just jumped to this drastic ban. This was an ongoing problem since the late 70s, and by this time, 85, it had gotten somewhat out of control, or very out of control. People died from the riot at this particular match. Then another famous one that you may have heard about yourself is the Hillsborough catastrophe. This was a 30 for 30, and just recently, some of the stadium operators at the Hillsborough Stadium were held accountable in court. Which may seem crazy because the disaster happened in 1989, but it was actually had been going through the court system in England for that long. This was not as related to hooliganism as the Heysel disaster. In Hillsborough, what happened was you had, again, it involved Liverpool. You had them playing Nottingham Forest. And there was really, this is more of, while hooliganism played a small role, this is more of a function of the fact that the English clubs had not really updated their stadiums. They didn't have the same event management protocol and professionalism that we had here in the States. They were still sort of operating with these terraces within their stadiums at either end. And because they didn't have the security and they didn't have the entrance and exit flow and the correct sort of number of gates for the amount of crowd that they had or expected at particular matches, what happened was you had this crush of people pushing in to a particular gate, trying to get into the stadium for the match, and there was no rows of seats or anything separating people once they were inside the stadium at that particular end of the stadium. And then you also had, because of the violence that was going on in the stands, you had chain link fences that separated the pitch from the terrace, so that fans in the terrace couldn't easily throw things on the pitch, which was also a problem at the time. But what happened was it created this barrier that people got crushed up against when people were trying to come in through the gate, which was at the back of the stadium. They're pushing people that are in the terraces up against the chain link fence at the pitch, and almost 100 people died from suffocation because they got pushed so intensely against that chain link fence, because there just wasn't proper stadium security and proper, like I said, flow in and out of the stadium, which of course now we think about quite a bit when we're designing or renovating stadiums. The picture that you see there on the slide is from the Hillsborough catastrophe. You see people were getting crushed, and people from the upper deck were trying to pull people out of the crush of humanity there and into the upper deck. So after these two terrible disasters, tragedies, there started to be more and more pressure finally on the clubs, the English clubs specifically, to do something to address this violence. So what was it that stopped the violence, the hooliganism, but also the stadium catastrophes that were happening because these stadiums weren't up to common code, building code. And what finally happened is essentially nonviolent fans started to speak up more and more and say, hey, this is not acceptable. You know, if I'm a football fan and I can't even take my kids to a match, or even my spouse, my girlfriend or my wife, to a match because it's so dangerous and I don't want her exposed to that, or I don't want my kids exposed to that type of violence, then that becomes a problem, right? And I stop attending matches because of the violence, and I'm upset because I want to follow my local club, I want to attend matches. So these nonviolent fans started to get more and more boisterous and expressing their opinions, and stop spending money, stop going to the matches. And that really got the team administrators to take notice and to start to say, okay, hey, we need to get more serious about addressing the aspect of hooliganism and also upgrading our stadiums. And in the process, they saw a money-making opportunity as well, not only to bring the nonviolent fans back in and feel safe and enable them to bring their kids and their spouses to the matches, but also an opportunity in the renovations to make some more money, right? To build some luxury suites, to get more corporations to put money into buying suites or buying club seats. And the same thing happened here in the U.S. We saw that huge building boom of stadiums starting in the early 1990s with Camden Yards, kind of kicked it off in baseball. Actually, overall, the Palace of Auburn Hills in Detroit kicked it off in 1989. That opened, and it had the most suites by far that any arena had ever seen in the world. And that sort of kicked off this building boom across sports, which happened first in North America and then in England and Europe with their stadium renovations. They started to incorporate the same idea of, hey, let's build more luxury seating, which we can sell for more dollars for the space that it takes up, right? All about revenue opportunities. But at the same time, they also saw this benefit in England and Europe of, hey, if we can get more corporate types in here and raise ticket prices a little bit, that might help keep some of the hooligans out that are only coming to recruit for their political movement or to cause violence, right? They might not be willing to come into the stadium if it costs a little bit more to come in there. We also saw them start to take the terraces out and add in fixed seating, right, which makes it harder to move around and recruit if that's what you're there for, or cause violence. It also reduces the chance of anyone being crushed up against a chain link fence. They took the fences out and added netting instead, which had much more give to it between the stands and in the pitch itself. So basically, it's renovation of stadiums in response to some of the non-violent fans speaking up much more is what started to squelch the violence that was happening at stadiums. And as I mentioned, club managers proceeded by renovating the stadiums themselves. So the other thing that's happening here that's of course related to this hooliganism is racism and anti-Semitism. And some clubs have a history of being attached to Judaism, and they've been known as the Jewish clubs traditionally over time. So the book talked about a couple clubs, very popular clubs, Tottenham in the EPL and English Premier League, and then Ajax, which is a team in the Netherlands, probably the most famous team in the Netherlands, based in Amsterdam, that were traditionally were Jewish clubs, or had that identity surrounding them. And what was the fans' reaction to this? Well, of course, the neo-Nazi movement is very anti-Jewish, and you would see things in the stands like the picture that's demonstrated here, where you have the Nazi flag brought in by opponents to these clubs, something that we would think of here in the U.S. as being extremely inappropriate and unacceptable, but was allowed to go on in Europe for quite a long stretch of time. Now the clubs would certainly not allow this show club. But the fans of these particular teams, Tottenham and Ajax, I think the authors give this example of a cheer of the Tottenham fans, would somewhat embrace this identity, even though many of their fans were not Jewish, and the teams actually had German players on them. And Tottenham fans had a cheer about Jurgen, who was a German that played for Tottenham, and said Jurgen was a German, but now he's a Jew. Saying that, hey, he plays for Tottenham, so he's a Jew. Obviously, he's not really a Jew, but they embrace that identity and that historical connection. They even use the Israeli flag as a symbol of their identity and their struggle against the outgroup, which in this picture, extreme picture, would be, of course, the Nazis from the other side. So you see how this kind of, we're not used to this in American sports, this type of intertwining of clubs and ethnic identities or even racial identities, right? And so even though all of the fans didn't actually share this identity, they embraced that identity of the club as part of who they are. Another example of this on the religious side is Rangers and Celtic. So this is in the Scottish Premier League in Glasgow. These are the two most popular teams, and within Scotland there's lots of tension between Protestant and Catholic. The Rangers represented Protestants, Celtic represented Catholic, and these teams took on those identities. So if you were in Scotland and you were Protestant, the Rangers were your major team or your mega club, if you will. If you were Catholic, then Celtic was your team, and they took on those identities. And so you have violence that erupted around this huge rivalry because there's a rivalry between the religions, and the clubs represented not just clubs themselves but also represented religions. So you've got two clubs, they're in the same locale, and they also represent different identities in terms of religion, and then of course you have the team identity itself. So another example of something that we're not really used to. If I was to say the Cincinnati Reds represent the Republican Party, or the Cincinnati Reds represent Catholicism, that would just be ridiculous, right? We would say, like, no, the Reds don't represent Republicans or don't represent Democrats. They represent the city of Cincinnati. No, they don't represent a certain ethnicity or religion. But that's part of the history of a lot of different association football clubs, especially in Europe, but also in South America too. So as I was saying, these clubs were somewhat slow to respond to racism surrounding their clubs, but eventually they did. Getting into the late 90s and then 2000s, they realized, hey, this is unacceptable. We can't have this type of violence and even just discrimination and open prejudice tied in and involved with our sport. So they did several campaigns. You see a picture here of players before the match standing together with a banner, "Say No to Racism." They did a big campaign called "Give Racism the Red Card," meaning get it out of the sport of soccer. So they did eventually come together and try to fight against this, and it's an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing fight that still continues to this day. But there's a lot of history behind it, which is why it makes it somewhat difficult for them to break those ties. And they didn't react as quickly as they should have. So what about fan violence and racism in U.S. sports? How is it different from Europe? Well, for one thing, and as this screenshot demonstrates here, I think this is in Lexington, Kentucky, so not too far from us at Northern Kentucky University. Maybe a few of you students are even in that picture. No, I'm just kidding. They're riding after the national championship that they won a few years ago. So a lot of our violence around sports happens as celebratory violence. It's spontaneous, unstructured. It just randomly happens. People aren't planning to go out and commit violence. Usually alcohol is involved. Not to say that we don't still have racism in U.S. sports, because it does exist, but it's not ingrained into the sport in the same way that it was ingrained into European soccer. And what we do have more of in the U.S., or seems more prevalent or more open, is classism, right? And some of you can probably think of your high school experience. I went to a very rural, poor high school outside of Canton, Ohio, and even in my high school, when we would play the more urban high school, they would make fun of us for being farmers and being very poor. We would make fun of them for being uppity or being rich, being preppy. And the reverse happened then when I went to college. I went to undergrad at Miami of Ohio. And at Miami, it's known for being very preppy, right? So when we would play other schools in the MAC, their student section would make fun of us for wearing khakis and, J. Crew U, call us J. Crew U. And we would make fun of them with some sort of chant like, hey, ho, or what was the chant? I think it was, hey, ho, it's okay, you're going to work for us someday. So classism, right? And that was just kind of, and still is, somewhat accepted much more than any sort of overt racism or any kind of violence, right? Of course, isn't accepted for any reason, or we hope isn't accepted. So what's different between the U.S. and Europe, right? Why does Europe have this problem of more structured and planned hooliganism happening at some of their events versus here in the U.S., where our violence is much less, not that it never happens, but it doesn't happen nearly as much per game or per capita, I guess, as it does in Europe. Well, there's several differences, right? One is that we don't have the same connections of our teams with other sources of identity, like we were just describing, right? I gave the Reds as an example, as an extreme example. The Reds don't represent a religion or a political party. They don't represent other sources of identity beyond their location. So when somebody, if I'm a big Reds fan and somebody attacks the Reds or, downgrades the Reds or makes fun of the Reds, they're making fun of my sports identity, but they're not making fun of my religious identity. They're not making fun of my political identity. They're not making fun of my ethnic identity really in any way. So that's a difference, right? Another difference is we had a much more success of minority athletes within our professional sports at an earlier time than they had in Europe, right? So even though it did take a while for our sports to integrate here in the U.S., it didn't take as long as it took in Europe for them to integrate soccer. And we had teams that were a majority of minorities. So think about basketball. In the NBA, I want to say that I think it's like in the 70% range of the athletes are black. And it's been that way for quite a while, right? And I don't think we think a whole lot about it. Not that racism doesn't come up occasionally, but we've become accustomed to that in the U.S., whereas in Europe, it took much longer for their teams to integrate and for them as fans to sort of welcome that integration as just part of the sport. Another thing is we have more distance between our teams, so it's harder for away fans to travel to the games and encounter the home fans than it is in Europe, where the teams are very close together. A lot of the teams, a lot of them in the same city even, because they have open leagues versus us with closed leagues where franchises control a certain geographic area. They do not have that same system. Also, we have our allegiances in the U.S. are spread over usually multiple sports, whereas they focus so much on soccer. It's so hegemonic to their culture and dominant that that it's different than our situation here in the U.S. where yes. If I'm in the Cincinnati metro area, I might be a Reds fan, but I might also be a Bengals fan. I might be an FC Cincinnati fan, right? So if the Reds have a bad year, hey, maybe the Bengals will have a better year, or maybe FC Cincinnati will be successful this year, right? So my sports identity is spread over multiple teams and not as focused on one particular club that represents everything in sports to me. So hopefully that helps kind of explain a little bit as to why there's hooliganism and how the hooliganism started around sports in other parts of the world, and also some of the differences that we have here in the U.S. in just the structure and history of our sports, and why fortunately we do not have as much violence surrounding our sports. So that's an important, certainly an important distinction to understand.